Hello and welcome to EE 233. I'm your instructor, Gregory Myers. In this video, we're going to take a look at our main function inside of our fundamentals demo. If you've been following along with the earlier videos, we've accrued quite a few functions already. And quite frankly, we've turned our fundamentals.c into a little bit of a mess. What I mean by that is we can't do anything without commenting or uncommenting a specific line of code, and then we have to recompile. That's clearly not a very effective way of running a C executable. It works for prototyping, but we like to do a little bit better, particularly because we intend to add some more functionality to this executable. Well, we're going to do this in two parts. The first thing that I want to do in this example is I want to focus on argc and argv. What you're going to notice is that most command line applications leverage arguments. And what I mean by that is if we come out here to a command line for just a second, and I can look at any number of commands, but a good one is, for instance, ipconfig. ipconfig allows for you to do the configuration on your, or see and make some changes rather to the configuration of your network cards on your laptop or desktop. But before we run this command, what I'd like to do is first take a look at the help. And I do that by typing in ipconfig/?. And you'll see that there is a lot of information here. As a matter of fact, it can be several pages of information depending on the executable. But essentially what happens here is it gives you information about how to run this particular executable. And particularly, they give you some examples down here at the bottom. Now, this is a lot to take in this first example, but what I want you to recognize is that there is a way of passing information to our fundamentals demo. So in other words, if we were to, in this case, clear the screen one more time and run our fundamentals demo.exe and put some arguments or additional information after it, we can actually leverage that inside of the main. And that's what we're here to do in this video, is to see how that can be done. So the first thing that I want to do is I'm going to go ahead and declare a temporary variable that I am going to call rather ubiquitously or ambiguously rather index. And so it's just going to be an integer, and it's going to be int index. Now I'm not going to initialize it. We're actually going to do that inside of a for loop. This is one of your first opportunities to take a look at how C does looping. And so to begin with, what I want to do is I want to write a for loop, and I want that for loop to start off at index equal to 0. I then want it to continue up to, but not including, the value of argc. And argc is simply the number of arguments passed to your executable. And at that point, then, I simply want to increment the index. So the first thing to note here is, like I said, argc is simply the count of the number of arguments. Now, we'll get into what those are in just a second, but the argv then is an array of arguments from the command line. And so basically, argc just tells you how many elements are in argv. Well, what we'd like to do now is we'd like to simply just print out not only the index, but also what the argument is at that particular index or that particular element in the array. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to create this kind of fancy looking print f, in which case I'm going to have argv square brackets %d, which allows for me as a placeholder then to have the index of a particular argument. And I'm going to say has the value %s, and we haven't yet seen %s, but it was in the Wikipedia article talking about the format specifiers, and that is a null terminated character array. In other words, something we're going to refer to as a string. And at this point, then, I'm going to follow this up with a new line. You can make this as fancy as you want to. Perhaps you can even add a period if you'd like. But essentially, in that first placeholder, I simply want the index. In that second placeholder, what I want to do is I want to take argv square brackets and then that index. Now, once again, this assumes that you've had a course with MATLAB or possibly Python or even a C++ course. So hopefully you've at least seen how to do some sort of indexing. The big difference is that in C, the indexes are simply surrounded with square brackets. The other important thing to note is that in C, indexing is zero-based. In other words, 0 is your lowest index in an array. So let's get started here. Let's go ahead and build this. Notice that I have commented out all of my other code because right now the only thing we want to run is this for loop. And I'm going to come out here once again to the command window. And at this point, what I'd like to do is I'd simply like to run fundamentals_demo. Well, we didn't pass it any additional arguments, but if you notice, it still found one, meaning that you will always have at least one argument, and that will be the name of the executable. So probably one thing that would be worth doing real quick is to add an additional print statement. In this case, whatever the value is of argc, and we simply print it. So that way we can always know how many arguments we actually have. So in this case, I'm going to go ahead and build it one more time. And this time when I run it, you'll see that argc actually has a value of 1, despite the fact that we haven't added anything past the executable. Well, let's rerun it one more time. I'm going to make my window just a little wider here. And now I'm going to add something called argument 1. Okay, what you add doesn't really matter. If I hit enter, you'll see now that argc is 2 and that my argv square brackets 0 is still the name of the executable, but now I also have argv square brackets 1, which essentially is the value that was captured from the command line. And I can do this as many times as I'd like. Well, what if we'd like to pass perhaps a little more meaningful information? So let's say, for instance, that I would like the first argument to be my first name. So you'll see my arg count is 2. The 0th argument is the fundamentals demo.exe, or the name of the executable. The argv square brackets 1 is my first name. I can do the same thing with my last name, and you see now I have a total argument count of 3. But what if I want to provide an address? So in this case, why don't we do something like 123 sample way? Well, if you would add these up, you'll notice that that now is 6 arguments. But that definitely was not what I had in mind. The idea is that 123 sample and way was the address that I wanted to provide. So how can we pass things that have spaces in them? Well, we can do that by simply providing double quotes around anything that we want to have treated as a single argument. And so now when I run this, you'll see that I have a total of 4 arguments, with the 0th argument still being the executable name. In this case, the first one being my first name, the second one being my last name, and then the argv square brackets 3, or the 4th argument being the address of 123 sample way. Do note that the double quotes has now been removed. So essentially, when the command line arguments are parsed, double quotes are taken out. In order to include the double quotes, you have to play some games here of figuring out how many quotes do you want to include. And you'll see here that in some cases, it will strip out the quotes and still include the spaces here. So how can we actually get the quotes into our arguments? So one way to do this is actually to include 4 sets of double quotes around any argument that you wish to have with spaces as well as the double quotes included. So essentially what you're doing is you are including the double quotes in the argument itself. Now, once again, going back to our code, you'll see that we've done a couple of things here. We've jumped straight into learning how to use a for loop. Key thing to note here is that I had to declare my index variable. I initialized it inside of the for loop. In the second step here is the criterion for breaking the for loop. In other words, if we have an argc of 1, which as we learned will always happen with C in that we have at least one argument, while 0 is less than 1, in other words, this loop will run exactly once and then it will increment. The next time around, then 1 will in fact not be less than 1, so this loop will only run once. It will print out the argument by virtue of using this %d for the index and the %s for the argument at a specific index. Once again, note that we're starting off with 0 in C. Hopefully you found this video useful. As always, if you have any questions or comments, don't hesitate to email me, and thank you for watching.